Although New Hampshire is known as the Granite State, I think an argument could be made that it should also be known as the Water State. From the famous lakes, Winnipesaukee and Squam, to the large rivers, the Connecticut, the Merrimack, the Androscoggin, to the many streams and streamlets that dot the landscape of the state, water has had an important and integral component to the history of the state and maintains that status with the many opportunities that it presents for recreational purposes like swimming and boating and fishing, to simply the pure aesthetic aspects of water. In fact, water has a great demand with some of the highest property taxes associated with sites located along lakes and rivers in the state. So we have a great appreciation for water in New Hampshire. In fact, a recent study from the Carsey Institute found that 98% of New Hampshire residents feel that clean water is an important aspect to their quality of life. We value water, and in many ways we have become quite accustomed to having good, clean, quality water. Water was very important in the industrial development of New Hampshire. For example, trees that were harvested in the northern mountains of the state were then transported via the larger rivers like the Pemigewasset and Androscoggin to the sawmills further away, where they were then processed into lumber and shipped via rail to the urban centers of the east. More importantly, water provided a ready source of power that was necessary to turn the large machinery that was necessary for the production of textiles and the various products that were being produced by these mills. Additionally, water provided another benefit, in that it was a way to rid the factories of the leftover waste materials that they no longer needed. Simply pump the stuff out into the river and it would be carried away for you. There's stories of days along the Merrimack where residents knew what colored fabric was being produced simply by the color of the water that day, whether it was red or orange or yellow or green, just simply by the material, the waste products that were being dumped into the river. Many of these dyes used heavy metals in their productions. Metals such as cobalt, copper, chromium, lead, and mercury. These would be dumped into the river, and traces of these still can be found today. As you can imagine, areas along New Hampshire and Massachusetts where these mills were located wasn't a very pleasant place to be. In fact, the water there wouldn't resemble anything like what we would expect to see today. In fact, in the 1950s, when people became more and more aware of the issues of pollution, a study was done and an identification of the most problem water areas was made. You'll notice that New Hampshire comes in a dark color along with most of the northeastern part of the country. So there was a growing awareness of issues of pollution associated with water at this time. The level of pollution in New Hampshire rivers by the 1950s and 60s is at such a point that we probably have a hard time even comprehending it as it is today. Descriptions of sewage being so dense that a single drop of river water would contain dangerous levels of bacteria, fecal coliform bacteria. That toxic metals and wastes, including phenol, cyanide, and other heavy metals, would be found in the rivers, and that suspended solids from raw sewage being dumped in would actually cover the river bottom and start to decompose, resulting in gases bubbling to the surface as if the river was cooking, and the predominant smell of rotten egg from hydrogen sulfide gas, which actually would ruin paint on boats and houses nearby the rivers. And then finally, the impact on fish populations in New Hampshire rivers was tremendous, both from the pollutants in the water, but also from the construction of these dams associated with the mills that prevented migration and spawning for many of the fish species, and thus resulting in a decimation of fish stocks statewide. Maybe the final breaking point occurred in the early 1970s when the infamous Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught fire, raising awareness of Americans across the country into the desperate situation that many of our water bodies had. This resulted in a couple of laws being passed in the early 1970s, both the Clean Air Act of 1970, but also the Clean Water Act of 1972, which helped to create laws and enforcement of these laws, which would allow the government to actually control the levels of pollutants being dumped into our rivers. This resulted in a quick turnaround in many streams and rivers in New Hampshire to the point that levels of pollutants today are much, much lower than they were even 50 years ago. It's even hard to comprehend how the rivers that we see today can even bear resemblance to those of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, simply from the enforcement of new regulations and laws.